EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. I'm delighted to chat with two reporters from Texas, Hannah Dellinger and Alejandro Serrano, both staff writers for the Houston Chronicle. Though, Alejandro, you've just moved to the Texas Tribune, right?
Correct. Yes, I started last week, actually.
Okay. Well, welcome both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
We're going to talk a little bit about your 7-month investigation in which you published a prodigious number of stories on book bans in Texas. Do you even know how many stories you published?
By our count, it's about 25, though these issues kind of seep into all kinds of stories these days. So at least 25.
Wow. That would have really scared me as a reporter kind of starting out, taking on 25 stories. Did you set out to do that many stories in your series, or did it just evolve?
Well, I think what ended up happening is we had kind of a North Star, but then there would be developments in the day in, day out of our regular jobs that were related to the theme, and we felt we had to report those stories.
And so were you exclusively doing stories on book bans, or were you doing other stories as well?
Other stories as well. Alejandro is covering Houston ISD, which is the largest district in the state. So he had quite a bit of regular work to do. And then I was covering the suburban districts. So a lot of this was like extra time outside of working hours.
Okay, so set the scene for us. When you started in, I guess it was early 2022, why did this topic appeal to you? Like, what was going on in Texas at that time?
Sure. So there had already been some previous reporting on South Lake near Dallas in Texas. NBC News had done some great stories on what was happening there with kind of like cultural clashes. But what got my interest was there were a couple of book bans here in local schools near Houston that I just did like daily stories on. And once I realized these are public records that I can request, it kind of opened my mind to, so this might be an issue that we'd be able to quantify. We chose this as a project for EWA, as a fellowship project, because we wanted to choose something that we knew we would need the funding for. And because of all the hours it took, the EWA funding really made it possible for us to be able to do that.
Well, that is really good to hear.
It's kind of a combination of things, too. Going back to a year ago, Houston schools had a new superintendent, and he went on a listening tour. And I ended up writing a side story about that tour, that the district has some 275 schools, and a year ago had like 55 librarians or 60. And Hannah and I were pretty shocked at that. And at the same time, Hannah had learned of the fellowships. We were brainstorming ideas, and then I don't even remember how, but one day we were like, well, we're sure no one tracks like book challenges and bans. Like, there's not really an authoritative database of sorts. And that was kind of like when we got the crazy idea to try to do it ourselves.
I am so glad you did, because just reading through the series, like, just remarkable stories. So let me go back a little bit. So before 2021, like, could a parent stop their child from reading a book in school, or had you not come across something like that before? Like, I'm trying to figure out how book bans evolved.
Book bans and challenges are really nothing new. I remember like one of the first stories I ever covered as an ed reporter in Virginia was about a book ban. And it was a title that dealt with LGBTQ plus characters. So, I mean, this has always been an issue. I think what's different about it in 2022 compared to previous years is that politicians have really made this into a hot button issue to, garner support from their base. And because of that, the numbers have just gotten a lot more. Like, a lot of the librarians Alejandro talked to said they would have like maybe one or two challenges in like their entire careers. And now it's like you get a whole list of hundreds of books that you have to investigate.
You covered protests at the Capitol, a federal civil rights lawsuit that was filed. In one of your stories, you wrote, State Representative Matt Krause put out a list of nearly 850 books and asked every district in the state to check their shelves for those titles. Then Governor Greg Abbott directed the Texas Education Agency to investigate criminal activity involving, quote, the availability of pornographic material that serves no educational purpose in public schools.
Yes. And as a result of those correspondences, TEA put out a guidance for districts to rewrite their policies around book selection and challenges to specifically define what is harmful to a child under like the state law for exposing children to pornography. And then we did, of course, find in our main story that most of the challenges were due to the Matt Krause list in the letter that some districts got.
I'm kind of curious, which books have been banned? Do you know the most common ones?
The ones that we found in our investigation, and these titles do line up with what the American Library Association found in their newly released report. But the number one most challenged or banned book in our investigation was Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jesse Andrews, New Kid by Jerry Kraft, This One Summer by Mariko Tamaki, All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. And so it goes on, but most of these books deal with main characters who are people of color or have like some kind of descriptions of sexuality, or they have LGBTQ plus characters.
Mm-hmm. These are also books, though, which are geared towards young adults, right? And so the kind of coming of age themes would be prevalent.
Right. All of these are the ones that I listed are young adult novels. So they're written for children in high school and middle school also.
So why don't some parents and politicians want these books in public schools?
It varies. Some parents and school districts had pretty genuine concerns that they had found. Like, there was one school district who had found a book that meant for teens in an elementary campus, and they were like, all right, well, this is a mistake, but this is at least reason to look at the rest of our shelves. So that's like one end of the spectrum. Then the other end is, kind of what we hear at some school board meetings, that people believe this is indoctrination of school children and think that it's kind of like the political left intervening in their child's life and don't want that. But there's a lot in between, and we tried to speak with people, I guess, like all the different sorts of opinions. And in school districts, we were pretty grateful for the ones who spoke to us, because some of them explained their reasoning as to why they felt the need to look into Krause's list, because frankly, others did not. And in the records we got, some school districts said, we're not doing this, and kind of didn't even respond to him.
Can you talk a little bit about, like, this was a really hot button issue? It wasn't just someone writing a letter to the editor.
Right. I did cover a lot of school board meetings where there were protests and a lot of pushback from parents, both parents who said that districts were censoring stories about LGBTQ plus characters and people of color, and also people on the other end of the spectrum who believe that these are somehow harmful to children. We did a Houston area version of this story back in March or April, and we put together a video of like kind of outbursts at school board meetings. I saw people get escorted out by police. I saw a school board president break his gavel trying to get decorum back in the room. I saw parents screaming over board attorneys who were explaining like why they couldn't talk about certain things during public comment. I also saw a lot of student activism. One student, Cameron Samuels in KDISD, they really led an effort to fight what they described as censorship. I've been covering school board meetings for years and years, and I remember a time when they used to be boring, and that is really no more.
When I covered school board meetings, my colleagues would say, "Oh my gosh, I feel so sorry for you. Like you'll really have to struggle to stay awake." But it doesn't sound like that.
No, not at all.
That was one of my follow-up questions, actually. How are the students reacting to all of this?
So some students that I talked to weren't really aware of what was going on in their districts. I guess just like they're not as keyed into reading local newspapers and keeping up on that. But other students, KDISD in particular, they really got involved. Cameron Samuels, who I was talking about before, they set up a book distribution of books that were not banned in their district, but had been commonly banned in others or were on the list to be reviewed. So a huge group of students just distributed those to their peers to like promote reading and also so that students could see themselves in stories about diverse perspectives.
One of the most depressing fallouts in reading your series has been how librarians have been treated. They faced harassment, insults, one has been fired. In an article you wrote, in Keller, local Facebook group pages and Twitter accounts have included pointed comments about librarians being heretical and portrayed them as pedophile groomers who order pornographic books. After a particular book challenge failed, one commenter included the phrase, "pass the millstones," a biblical reference to execution by drowning. That just sounds unbelievable. Like librarians?
Right. Yeah, I think it's been jarring to at least the ones we interviewed because we have to remember that librarians don't just put books on shelves. They're really there to kind of help teachers and classrooms and kids further grasp what they're learning, but also cultivate their own interests. Once you start going to a library on your own will, you start finding literature you may like, or you start poking around, like different softwares to learn different things. So yeah, being put in the political crosshairs, I think, shocked many, and it kind of just escalated to a point where people either tried to file criminal complaints alleging that librarians had stalked pornographic material or had threatened them. I know at least two librarians told us they had felt threatened. One even said that they and their colleagues had installed cameras in their home and they were really stressed out and just thinking of leaving the profession.
And already there are very few librarians in the school districts you looked at, right? Compared to the kind of standard guidance of having one in each school.
Right, and it's not that easy to become a librarian. You have to, go to school for it to become at least a certified librarian who is well versed in library services and can offer that supplementary teaching. Anecdotally, librarians were telling us, and even librarians who had gone on to positions of administration, that this summer, like leading up to us finishing this reporting, they were just seeing openings left and right. I remember one told us that a friend had asked them for help because one school district, which was relatively medium sized, not one of the larger ones like Houston or Dallas, had 11 openings this year. And the most that they had ever had was like 6.
I'm Kavitha Cardoza, host of EWA Radio. My guests are Hannah Dellinger and Alejandro Serrano, who produced a multi-part series with an interactive database on book bans in Texas. Hannah and Alejandro, what is your process? Because there must be dozens and dozens and dozens of school districts in Texas. So how did you start?
There are actually more than 1,200 school districts in Texas. And that's kind of why a lot of people kind of looked at us funny, like, you're crazy to try to do this. So basically, we started out with sending a Public Information Act request to more than 1,200 districts, all the districts in the state. And that initial request said any documents related to formal or informal challenges or bans of any learning materials. That was pretty difficult because a lot of the districts didn't even have libraries and they're very small. So that request didn't apply to most of the districts that we sent it to. And then we realized that we needed to send a second one because we wanted it to be more broad, and also because districts can use different language to mean a book challenge. So we sent a second request out to nearly 600 districts that serve 90% of the state's 5.4 million public school students. And with the second request, we said a list of any books challenged or pulled for review, regardless of the reason, like formal, informal, or in response to the Matt Krause letter. And when we did that, that's how we found out what ended up being our main story, which was that most of the book reviews and removals were driven more by politicians than parents. And the parent complaints really were just a fraction of all of the books that were pulled to review for appropriateness.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you organize your notes? Because you must have been getting just lots of responses every day, and you're supplementing it with interviews with parents and librarians. And so how did you organize all your notes and documents?
So we used Google Drive so that Alejandro and I could see each other's work, and we created a spreadsheet for all of the responses to kind of keep track of who has responded and who hasn't. And also, it was really helpful. We created a separate email account so that it would all be in one place and it wouldn't get jumbled up with all the other emails we get every day. And so we just filed them in like different categories, and that helped a lot. But having a spreadsheet really was the only way to keep track of all this. And we worked with data visualization journalists from the beginning to say, hey, what's the best way for us to organize this so that it makes sense and so that you all are able to build an interactive database that we can put online.
Mm-hmm. What were you hoping to get out of the interactive database?
I think just show people what we found if they wanted to poke through it, beyond the stories and what we wrote about. To this is public information, and we believed in publishing it. And if people were curious about their school system here, they could look it up.
And so you had information on the district, the books that were banned. What else?
We also had the outcome of the review. So that's what we published, but we also, like, within our own notes that were just for our personal use, we had links to all the documents and then the reasons that they were challenged or banned. It gave us a sense of what was motivating people to challenge these books. And a lot of it was like racist and homophobic and transphobic language in a lot of the complaints. But it did give you an idea of like what was motivating this or what people thought was inappropriate about it.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, I love collaborations, and I was wondering how your different styles of reporting, and you'll cover different districts, how did that influence your reporting or help your reporting?
Well, I'll admit, when we started, I told Alejandro, I'll deal with the data. I would rather do that than have to talk to people. So that was one way we kind of split it up. I mean, I obviously did in my own interviews too, but he really focused on like interviewing the librarians and everything. And I dealt with the data entry. He also did that too. I think that we also have like different perspectives. And so it was good to have that going into this. We also had only been education reporters at the Chronicle for like 3 months before we got the fellowship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we had only been working together for those 3 months. So we really learned a lot about each other as we went. And I've told Alejandro, like, I was so grateful to have such a competent partner on this. I didn't have to worry about doing it all myself. And I really think that our styles jived really well. So I'm very sad that he's left the Chronicle. But
No, I share that sentiment. We sat next to each other in the newsroom. So literally, sometimes we would have like the tiniest issue, trying to decide whether we logged an occurrence or not if it wasn't particularly a book. And we would talk about it for 20, 40 minutes. Just I think that helped a lot. Like we kind of over communicated in a sense, but that really helped iron out the methodology and keep it true to what we wanted to do.
Are there any ways in which y'all kind of butted heads or y'all saw things differently?
I don't think so. Did we?
No, I think the only thing is maybe length. we were
Yeah.
near the
Alejandro wanted, as any good newspaper reporter, like wanted to make sure we had concise language and all that. And I was kind of like, hey, we spent 7 months on this. It should be 100 inches. That's actually kind of miraculous that we never had any kind of issue now that I think about it.
What will each of you take away from this project?
I guess two things come to mind immediately. One, it just like to me reiterate the importance of trying to hear people out, and understand where they're coming from, and also parse what people say from like what's occurring. Because here we had a politician preaching parental rights, but we found that his list sparked a lot of these reviews more so than individual parents being concerned. And then the second thing is the value of this kind of work, and that it is doable. Like I think, especially with a partner like Hannah, like I think it's not just book bans. Like, I think I would be up for this kind of reporting about anything.
And you, Hannah?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I've always kind of felt this and seen it in other projects I've worked on. But this really hammered in the idea that people do want to see the whole picture for themselves. I think a lot of the reporting on this issue before did really focus on the parent aspect of it, which is very important. And a lot of that stuff is alarming and people need to know. But I think putting it in context, we were able to do that because we had this data. And then I guess the other takeaway I have is that through all this, I learned that like students really do have more power than adults give them credit for, and more wisdom, I guess, than we give them credit for. They can organize and they can make a difference just like any other adult. And they really are passionate about their rights and their education. And it was just really cool to see that.
I've been talking with Hannah Dellinger and Alejandro Serrano, reporters for the Houston Chronicle, when they produced a fantastic series on book bans in Texas. You can follow them on Twitter at @DellingerMedia and at Serrano_ALEJ. Thank you both so much for making the time to chat.
Thank you so much for having us.
Appreciate it.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Hannah and Alejandro? What was your experience covering book bans? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA, as well as Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.